Shabbat Shalom everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Torah Gems. I'm Rob, your host. This week we're going to be discussing the portion called Shemini, or Eighth. This week we have readings out of Leviticus, 2 Samuel, and Luke. Specifically, this week I want to share a vision that has grown in us, that is my wife and I, and that she had last cycle. She had this one last year when we read this section. And, you know, as I look around, I see that it's so timely and it's so necessary right now. She had the vision, of course, of Nadab and Abihu, and, you know, there's been a lot of theology written on the quote-unquote strange fire that Nadab and Abihu offered before the Lord. So what I'm going to attempt to do is to relate the revelation that my wife had, and there's going to be some things I'm going to add to it that have grown in us this year. What she saw was two houses, okay? The house of Israel and the house of Judah, okay? And that both nowadays and for the last several thousand years have offered strange fire before the Lord. What blows me away about that particular scripture is, like so many scriptures in the Tanakh, you'll be reading along, and then all of a sudden something just happens, and it's just boom, and it seems to be so arbitrary and odd. You know, I would think that these two brothers would have had to have a conversation, had an idea long before they actually went in to offer this strange fire. There would have had to have been something brewing in their hearts. You know, it's funny because the strange fire that we see is all the things that we add to it. You know, my wife says, you know, this is never designed, you know, biblical obedience was never designed by God to be complicated. You know, it's not complicated. You know, keeping the Passover isn't complicated, you know. And I'm going to use as an example myself now, getting away from her revelation, I'm going to use the Shabbat or the Sabbath as an example. So in using the Sabbath as an example, on the one hand, we have our brothers in the Christian church who are, you know, they change a Sabbath to a Sunday. You know, they say that it's scriptural and biblical, and now the Sabbath is Sunday. That's strange fire, because God never changes, His Word never changes, and the Sabbath has always been the final day of the week. On the Greco-Roman calendar, it falls on Saturday. On the other hand, we have our brothers in the other house, the house of Judah, and not meant to be an anti-Semitic comment at all. Please don't take it this way, or the former comment is anti-church. What I'm saying is that, you know, we have a few commandments that are given around the Sabbath to keep it holy and to delight in the Sabbath, and really not to prosper, you know, and you know, we say, okay, God, you know, that's all fine and good, but I think we want to add these other commandments because we know better. We've got a better idea of what it is that, you know, you ought to be doing. And the part in that frightens me the most is that this is the heart of man. Now, in the picture of Nadab and Abihu, we see two houses, of course. We also see two people coming into agreement, you know. As I watched the Passover and unleavened bread go by, I saw a lot of discussion, you know, in different places, Facebook being one of them, just as an example about, you know, how to keep the Passover and what we're supposed to do, and all kinds of questions asked. And I don't know, I'm just kind of floored by it, because even myself, I've asked that question. I've said to myself, how do we properly keep the Sabbath, praise God? How do we properly keep the Passover, praise God? You know, and then we're looking and we're going to books and we're asking people and stuff, and, you know, a lot of, you know, Messianics want to take on every single tradition that our Jewish brothers have, and it's like, well, you know, some of those traditions are not biblical. Am I saying that I'm against them? No, I like to stick with Yeshua, and I'm not saying that I'm better than anybody else. My point is, Yeshua warned against tradition, and how he warned against it was replacing the commandment of God with the traditions of men. When we equalize or put in front of or make more important the traditions of men, you know, this is not something that Yeshua looked kindly on. And if Yeshua's God in the flesh, when we got to realize Yeshua's God, God does not look kindly upon our ideas and machinations on how things should look, and I think that the challenge that comes to me year in and year out when I read this scripture, and when we read this scripture, when our family reads this scripture, is to watch out for it. My wife she's away this weekend, so I'm all, but she's got this wonderful gift of seeing things for just how they are, and she said, I'll say exactly what she said. She said she didn't want to reject a whole set of traditions and take on a whole other set of traditions that weren't scriptural or weren't biblical, weren't scriptural, and were the creations of men. And I agree with her. And I think that as people who have come into a realization of that the quote-unquote Torah is not done away, like let's call it messianics or whatever. It was funny. I actually saw a guy, I couldn't believe it. I saw it and I wanted to comment so bad. He put in a comment on Facebook. He actually said that, he says, well, when messianics want to be taken seriously, they'll establish themselves as a denomination with a hierarchy and leadership. Oh, you mean they'll burn strange fire before the Lord? Just like the Protestant church did? Well, I'm not a Paul or Apollos. I'm of Messianics, or I'm of, this, that, or the other thing. This is what I'm talking about. The traditions of men. And where does it start? It starts in the heart. Paul talks about it all through the apostolic writings in his letters. He talks about, which is not a circumcision in the flesh, but a circumcision in the heart. It starts in the heart. Now, as an example, does a family come into a full Torah realization that, they don't follow the teaching and instruction of God because they have to, but because they get to? The man may not decide to become circumcised if he's uncircumcised, but does he have his kids circumcised? Does he realize that there's a blessing in being God's teaching and instruction is a blessing to people? So why do we have to add to it? Well, it's part of our fallen state, brothers and sisters, and we have to watch for it like a hawk. It's, like the scripture says, God hath appointed me a watchman over unto Jerusalem, right? And the warning here is we come out of the church and then we start to, bash the church, which is, again, I believe, getting close to being lashon hara, or wicked tongue. I don't think that it is if we're educating, but we kind of go a little nuts with it. Yes, you know what? I've seen a lot of, exposure of the Catholic Church as being, having a lot of wicked and syncretistic practices. But, the Pentecostals did this in the 40s and 50s, and then turned around and preached from the pulpit to the public that the Torah's done away and we don't have to keep it. So come on, let's seriously, where is it? The strange fire starts in the heart. It starts with an attitude of the heart. If we are bought and paid for by Yeshua, because you see in the reading in Samuel, keys into this beautifully, because guess what? That is the promise of a Messiah from David's line who would cause the Torah to stand up in you. He is the living Torah. He is the Ha-Torah. He's the very essence of the Torah, made flesh, and did it so that we would have the example on earth how to follow it out. And he was always against the traditions and practices of men. And that starts in the heart. It starts as a strange fire burning inside of us and comes out in an outward action in this scripture and in an inward action, in an inward scene towards scripture and towards others. Is it Yeshua that speaks out of us? Or is it strange fire that is coming out of us? Shabbat shalom, everyone. Question I've said.